Okay, I think that should work. Thanks so much for making the time to chat. The time change was something I haven't fully appreciated until I started trying to coordinate with people in Europe about chatting. It was like, oh man, 8-9 hour difference. It's hard to find the right time frame where it's not too late or too early. So
I'm pretty used to it because I just had a family hall. Just a second. I'm just going to change so I can hear myself. Sure. There we go. There we go. Yeah, I've just had family in Japan, so having to tie in with them, we had a kind of a window of about 4 hours where my grandson wasn't going to bed, and we were only just getting up, So
okay. So you have family traveling in Japan or living in Japan?
Well, no, they literally came back. They had 3 months in Japan. They live in Helsinki in Finland, and my son and his wife and our grandson were there for 3 months, and they were setting up kind of business deals and stuff. The interesting thing about Tokyo is there's a direct flight from Helsinki.
Nice.
And my family they're both designers and they're both creatives. So it's it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool having them.
Are you planning to go to the Kokufuten next year for the 100th anniversary of it?
Do you know what? It's just too close to the trophy in Belgium. It really is, and I go there. I've been going there for, I don't know, the last 17 years, Yeah. And I've been very fortunate to, win a classification there, which is pretty good.
Yeah.
It's a really big deal, the trophy. It's one of the biggest shows outside of Japan, So I would love to have gone to Kokufu, but got a lot on.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's kind of a great kind of segue to the conversation that I'm hoping to have with you. So kind of just for some context, which I've emailed you a little bit about, is I'm working on an exhibition kind of tied to this idea of the upcoming World Cup and this idea of kind of all of these different cultures that have this shared love of soccer, and how that sort of spread globally and really has been incorporated into a lot of different cultures, and they've assimilated it. And I'm interested to see or to find out if that's true for bonsai, which I think there's some clear examples when we look at Japan and China, and you can kind of see the very distinctive cultural expressions of it sort of reflected in there. I'm curious about the West, though, and how, if there is that or has that developed yet, and talking to people like yourself who've been to, the trophy and all of these other sort of European shows and have been around and operate in Europe to kind of help get your input, almost like an anthropologist talking to people to describe kind of what they understand sort of their own culture to be, and then maybe to help contextualize it for that. So yeah, I guess before we kind of get too far down that road, are you a soccer fan? Do you have
wait a minute. I live in Manchester.
Ah, there you go. Needless
all right
thing.
Do I need to say anymore?
Yeah. So is it Manchester United? Is that?
Of course, don't say anymore. It's okay. Manchester United every day of the week.
Okay. All right. And so, I mean, you kind of are even just touching on this idea. So talk a little bit about like what that means as coming from Manchester and Manchester United. Like, you grow up just like that's just a given that you're gonna be a Manchester fan? And
absolutely. All right. Well, let's start first of all. You're either red or blue. It's as simple as that, and I think with your family, if your family is red, then you're red. That's it. Okay. And if your family is blue, then there's blue. I mean, there's an interesting thing. I'll talk about our local pub. When there's a derby game on, when Manchester United is playing the blue team, I can't even get myself to say it. When they're playing the blue team, everybody around here has grown up together. So there's never any trouble. There's a lot of crack going on. There's a lot of banter going on. And the only time, if ever there's any trouble, is when we've got somebody from the outside who happens to wander into the pub, And so it's a friendly rivalry, But if we want to talk about Liverpool, there's a big rivalry with Liverpool, you know, and Liverpool is only what, 45 miles away? Not even that, maybe 35 miles away if you're actually in. I live just on the outskirts of Manchester in the countryside, you know. So soccer it's in our blood. It's absolutely, you know, and we don't call it soccer, of course. We call it football, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I mean, that's even another component, the, the distinction between bonsai and pinjing, right? And how different cultures are going to have different
Yeah.
terms for the same thing. And me being from America, and most people in America, we have a different version of football, or American football. And so for me, I'm going to try to refer to it just as soccer for the American audience
Sure.
that we're going to be presenting it to. But that is a thing, right? There is this kind of a unique way that language refers to the same thing or differently. So yeah, so that's interesting. When you sort of look at bonsai then as this sort of extension of culture in a way in Japan and China and the Asian countries, how would you describe, I guess, your own culture, the characteristics of it? I'm wanting to sort of set a framework for British culture. And so you as coming from that culture, like how do you describe the core values of characteristics of UK culture?
All right. So as a nation, we're a very creative nation, strong creative nation. And let's just take ceramics, for example. We have craft potters, and some of the best bonsai potters, I would say, in the world have come from the UK, so we're very fortunate in that regard. So, and when it comes to appreciating real quality in creativity, we do recognize that, and, in our opinion, there's nothing worse than putting a tree in an exhibition in a very poor pot when we have access to great potters, and I think, it's important to us that we recognize very good quality. And it's been a very interesting thing in the UK since we came out of the economic union, the EU, with Brexit, because I was seriously concerned that the quality of our trees would go down because we are not exhibiting en masse in Europe. But I've been wrong. I've been proved wrong, because in actual fact, it's gone up. And sorry, we'll talk about exhibitions maybe later. But because we've had some very good big exhibitions, it's now getting tough to get into those exhibitions, and that's a good thing because it means the quality is there.
Yeah, that's fascinating. What do you attribute that rise in quality to, with the limitation of being able to show outside of the UK?
Well, teaching. There's a lot of very good teachers here in the UK. I'm sure you may well have spoken to some of them, but some of them are trained in Japan, some of them are self-taught, some of them have worked with a lot of the artists in Europe, including myself. And it's very interesting that we have a club culture here too. And certainly in the last 10 years, those clubs are inviting artists from Europe, from Japan, to come and work with them. So it's definitely in the teaching.
So you would say then you mentioned the quality, this kind of valuing of quality and craftsmanship. So what other sort of words or phrases come to mind when you're sort of thinking about British cultural identity?
Oh, okay. Gosh. There is definitely a move away from the Japanese aesthetic, without a doubt. And there is a move away from working with imported trees. Working with native trees has become actually the thing here, That was one of my concerns about leaving Europe, because we've had problems with bringing in trees from Europe now, native trees from Europe. But that has changed, thankfully, because our government has made a change. But you see, most of the artists now that are exhibiting in the UK are exhibiting native species. And for me, I've always worked with native species because, having a young family, I could never afford to buy good material from Japan at all, So I've always worked with native material. So I think that's a fundamental shift from, say, 30 years ago, when it was the cool thing to work on Japanese trees, white pines, black pines, and Chinese junipers and stuff. Well, I can tell you now, if you walk around a UK exhibition, Japanese trees account for less than 20%.
And you said 30 years ago, that might have been the opposite. You might have seen 80%
Absolutely.
of Japanese species.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's interesting. One of the things that I'm trying to do is go back through any European books that I can find and kind of look at the trees without the artist's name. Because, when you've been around as long as you have, you start to recognize trees. You've seen this one in this exhibition. They become well known. So you can kind of recognize a tree and whose it is without knowing anything else about it. I don't. So I'm trying to develop a visual reference to see if there's a way that you can identify a British tree from an Italian tree, from a Spanish tree, from a German tree. And one of the two things that have jumped out to me, even in these older exhibition books from maybe the 2000s or so, or the early Noelanders and whatnot, were the focus on the containers being these UK made ceramicists, sort of what you touched on, and the kind of this the arts and craft movement in Britain being very important, and having all of these sort of ceramic craftsmen, as well as this sort of deciduous bonsai, or the material being deciduous at some capacity, and there's usually some level of carving in those deciduous trees to hollow them out and sort of reflect the yews and the oaks that over time tend to hollow out. And so I'm curious, from your perspective, like, what other sort of, like, are you able to go through a show, maybe an international show, and identify a tree, like its country of origin, without knowing it? Like, could you be like, oh, that's got to be a Spanish tree, or that's an Italian
absolutely
tree?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Okay, let's talk about a European show. There's a clear difference between a UK show and a show that takes place on mainland Europe. The trees in the UK are smaller.
Okay.
All right, because access to material. So if you talk about the Spanish or the Italians, Slovenians, they have access to alpine material. The Yamadori that they've got traditionally is over, because it's American, I'll not say meters, it's over maybe 45 inches tall, So it's the show, like the Trophy, which was the Noelanders, it's now the Trophy. The average tree is 36 inches tall. Mm-hmm. Now, the average tree in the UK, I would say, is 24 inches to 30 inches maybe, and smaller, And I think that's because just access to raw material,
mm-hmm.
But the interesting thing is, it's harder to make a small tree than it is to make a big one, mm-hmm. So, and that's reflected, the quality of the smaller trees in the UK is very, very good. The problem you have is if you've got a chewing size tree, something around, 14 inches, you put it into a European show, it's lost, because you've got these massive, powerful images that it's running alongside of. So chewing, unfortunately, is lost. And most of my trees are chewing in size. Mm-hmm. But in a UK show, they're fine. Put them alongside some of the Italian stuff and the Spanish stuff, the Portuguese stuff. It's kind of lost.
And so so I guess the size of the trees, that's another component that I think is interesting. What are some of these other characteristic traits that you see represented in English and as well as sort of other nations, like the size difference, not just so access to material leads to larger tree sizes, but then there's also this kind of maybe, and this might be my outsider perspective, like the machismo or the bravado of these sort of romantic sort of base cultures versus the sensibility of the British culture and it being a little bit more economical and practical? I mean, do you see that represented, or is that more inferring that, as an outsider?
Okay, all right. It's considered a big deal if you've got a very old, expensive Chinese or Japanese container in your tree. And particularly going to an exhibition, it's considered a higher level if it's in a very beautiful, expensive imported pot. And I think that's a sad thing. It's a sad reflection because, I think what we're finding, I'm particularly finding in the European shows, is it's expensive trees, expensive material being beautifully styled, and I think your average, I'll say, club member would never get into that show. They would never get into that show. They have to work really, really hard because Danny Usa, who is this guy who selects the trees, is looking for maturity in the bonsai. There's a Japanese word for it, I can't remember what it is.
Yeah. Mochikomi, I think, is one word that comes to mind. The kind of years in the pot, right?
Yeah, you got it. And it's right, because at the end of the day, they want the best trees in the show. And I know, I've been very fortunate to get into every single one of the shows, bar one, because the tree wasn't quite, aged enough in the pot. I'm hoping to show that next year, by the way, Danny, just in case you're watching. But the thing to bear in mind, I've been doing bonsai 40 years, and I've had one of those trees 36 years. So it is beginning to look pretty cool. And I think, that's one of the problems people have, is that there's no such thing as instant bonsai, in my opinion.
Sure. Well, and I think, how do you then see too the material playing a role in that? Because at least from my perspective, access to conifers in mainland Europe versus predominantly deciduous species in Great Britain, deciduous trees take a lot longer to develop into a mature bonsai, whereas a conifer, you can get one into a show ready state within 5 years or so,
That's true. That's
really
true.
quickly. So do you think that's a component of the UK's sort of, I'll say a challenge, but just a unique component of bonsai there?
Okay, well, I'm gonna quote one of your guys from over the pond there, and he said, if you want to see the best deciduous trees in the world, I mean, he's talking about full-size trees. Ryan Neal said that, because and if there is one thing that we do well in the UK, it's deciduous trees. In fact, when I won best deciduous tree at the trophy, a few years ago, and the deciduous trees that we do have, hawthorns, Prunus spinosa, they are the best. The bark quality is good, and if you have one that you've worked over a number of years, the ramification is there, and it can stand alongside the best. But the thing is, they're invariably small in size. It's quite interesting because a couple of years ago, a friend of mine did show a very, very large hawthorn at the trophy, and it didn't even get a nomination, much to the surprise of many people. So it doesn't always pan out, And it was in a very expensive Japanese pot, by the way. So I'm not sure what the answer is, but we do have beautiful, small, deciduous trees,
Yeah, I think one of the questions that I'm interested too in hearing perspective on is this kind of connection between the environment, so the natural environment, and the culture, and how that's how they're connected, because you can't escape the fact that you live in the UK, and these are the trees that naturally grow there, and they're mostly deciduous, so it's going to inform your idea of what a tree looks like, and that's going to inform your bonsai. And the same is true for wherever one lives, right? You're sort of referencing your own species of tree and your own sort of growth habits. And so do you think there's a way beyond though just species? Because you could go in and be like, oh, that's a mugo pine, so it's probably from, Spain, or it's probably from Italy, or if it's, how can you look past those species alone to see those characteristics that might identify it from a certain culture? Like stylistically, like how they style trees, like how they form the silhouette, or how they incorporate the branch structure, or the formation of pads. Like any of the kind of design aspects of bonsai are unique or identifiable to, and I think maybe more individuals, but then you also know
Yeah. It's down to the individual artist more than anything else.
uh-huh.
If you look at some artists, the refinement is so exquisite. I can tell you now, I know exactly who that artist is by the work that they've done and how they present it.
Mm-hmm.
One of the cultural things that is becoming more prevalent is the way that trees are being presented.
Mm.
They're not necessarily being put in a pot. At the very last, the trophy that took place this year, the special category was rock plantings. But I've seen people planting stuff, in tin cans. I've seen people planting stuff, on roots, it's quite interesting how people are expressing themselves differently now. Not everybody likes it. The traditionalists don't like it, but we're going back 20 years ago. I know, probably not that much. 15 years ago, I presented a Prunus spinosa on a stump of wood wrapped in barbed wire. And I did it as a sort of homage to Amnesty International, as part of a project for Amnesty International. That is the most requested photograph of mine from Japan. That's the one that they want. They say, oh, this is European style. This is unusual, blah, blah, blah. I think it's been featured in about 4 books,
Mm-hmm.
And they've never paid me, by the way, but that's another story.
Sure.
Yeah. but so, I am excited by the fact that people are exhibiting their trees differently. They may not necessarily be putting them with a scroll. They might not put it on a table. They might put it on, a whole lot of gravel or broken glass.
Yeah. I came across this photo, and I'd like to explore that topic that you sort of are referencing. Though one is, what sort of countries do you see more like moving away from these traditional displays? Is there any sort of, again, cultural things we can draw from that? Like, would you say it's more in sort of the UK and sort of more Anglo-Saxon, or is it more kind of the Italian, Spanish? Like, do you see any kind of broad observations from that?
I am of the opinion that if you do something out of the ordinary, the focus still has to be on the tree.
Agreed.
It has to be. You can't put, a third quality tree in a crazy display and think it's going to, impress people. It
Absolutely.
isn't.
Yeah.
The tree has to be good. It's simple as that.
Actually, I think it has to be better. It has to actually be better than good, because people are going to criticize if you can't do bonsai well. Why do we have to pay attention to your avant-garde kind of idea, right?
All right. So as far as countries are concerned, the UK for sure. I mean, if you take someone like Peter Warren is, producing some beautiful, beautiful examples, which are not the norm. Mm-hmm. Elegant, natural looking design, beautiful, beautiful stuff. So certainly the UK, we've always kind of pushed the envelope so far as presentation and creativity is concerned, mm-hmm. And I think the Dutch as well, they're a little out there with the way that they're doing some presentation stuff. Mm. The Danes as well, Danish, are producing some really amazing trees now in the way that they're presenting them,
But do you have just real quick?
Let me just run something past you. Something past you. A lot of people don't like Picasso. They don't, because they think it's a bit, it's not very nice. It's, it doesn't truly represent. Yet, as a graphic artist, Picasso's early work was amazing. It was. I mean, I love Picasso, but you see, you can't do the weird abstract stuff unless you've done the groundwork. You know, you've got to have done the groundwork first before you can start doing the crazy stuff.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Who would you say in the Netherlands, and what was the other country you mentioned?
Denmark.
Yeah, who would you identify as an individuals who are sort of doing those things that you're sort of talking about?
Well, there's a lady there, amazing lady called Pia, and she exhibited this year at the trophy with a really unusual species, and it was incredibly well presented. But what I would say, not in the classical style, you know. Um, Unfortunately, we lost an amazing artist in Holland, Tunishan.
Yeah,
Um,
I saw that.
it broke my heart. You know, he was really sort of inspiring in the work that he was doing. Um, Hans van Meer, again, producing some interesting work. Carlos van der Vaar, again, you know. So we're very fortunate that, you know, a lot of these people who I know personally, they're good friends, you know,
Mm-hmm.
they are prepared to try something different,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, I'm curious also too how much history plays a role in that, because certain countries have had stronger relationships with Japan over the course of their,
Mm.
cultural exchange, and so maybe countries that were less had less of that, maybe have less of that sort of sense of maintenance of tradition. One of the things that was interesting was I was able to email some of these questions to Walter Paul, and he was talking about the sort of Austrian German culture of sort of this appreciation of order and sort of following the rules. And we can only we kind of know how that can be taken to an extreme, but at the same time, kind of like your barbed wire Spinoza, it's like he's the one that's known for kind of the German style as a sort of naturalistic, but he's like, actually, I'm the outlier. Most German practitioners, they want to follow the traditional Japanese, like that's right or wrong bonsai. And so, yeah, it's just interesting to know kind of like countries that maybe have a stronger connection to Japan at some point, like the U.S. does. We have a lot of history with Japan, and a lot of Japanese immigrants have been in the country for a long time. How does that influence the sort of adherence to the traditional Japanese kind of approach? Maybe more so like in Italy, or some other countries. So I mean, I guess I'm curious. Do you see that play out, or is that just maybe kind of
Actually, yeah, that's you know, I've never actually thought about that, but I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. You see, if you look at some of the artists that were early in the, I mean, when I first started in bonsai, there was no internet. The only books that we had were either Japanese books or some English books by some English artists, which when you look back on them now, oh my God,
right?
they're naive.
Sure,
for,
and
for
that's
what,
what you're saying. You're having to learn that process, right? It's sort of
yeah.
that cultural learning.
Yeah, so it was very interesting that certainly in Italy they were bringing artists from Japan. They did have Kimura, they
Mm-hmm.
did have Suzuki, you know, Kaneko. They had them coming in there. So I think that the Japanese aesthetic is more ingrained in Italy for
Mm-hmm.
sure, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and not so much here, you
Mm-hmm.
know.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's yeah, that's interesting. I'm going to use that. That's pretty
All right,
cool. Yeah.
go for that. Yeah, well, that's the whole point of these conversations, is to try to get other people to think about it in this way, because that's just so interesting to sort of see how, because when we see Japan and we see China, you can see the cultural values expressed. And my question is too is it has bonsai been practiced long enough in the West for that unique expression to sort of emerge? Because like you're saying, you have to kind of imitate the basics to really learn them, and imitation is predominantly going to be replicating Japanese forms and
Sure.
maybe in Chinese forms. And so maybe we don't have, or maybe a unique cultural identity takes time, like centuries, to be ingrained. But then I think of soccer as being something that's not as old. Bonsai is older, at least in modern soccer comparatively, but yet in like this in South America, soccer is so ingrained in their cultural identity. Nations have gone to war over soccer matches, right? And so obviously it's different. The the appeal of soccer is much broader than bonsai, but I'm just curious about how, on a broader sense, culture that's foreign or that sort of disseminates out from a certain area, how long does that take before it sort of is manifested in as an individualistic way? And so do you have any thoughts on that at all?
I think uh, I think here in the UK we are more inward looking in the way that we approach things. I have a study group that comes with me, 10 guys and girls that come to my place, and I encourage them to go to exhibitions. I encourage them to do that, and it's quite interesting when they first come, they're bringing trees which are simply plants in pots, so but that excites them, and
Sure.
somebody once said, when we're born creative, and then as we get older we get it knocked out of us. And I think that's to some extent the same with bonsai, is that I still get excited about a 4-year-old larch tree, the way someone's worked it. So I don't want to lose my thread here, but it's not there's no easy answer, I don't think, here.
Well, and I wonder too, the fact of Great Britain being an island, has that insular sort of tendency, right? You're sort of, I mean, less so today than in the past, right? We have access to the internet and transportation is very easy, but yeah, just this idea of being on an island does maybe make you more inward facing or inward focused.
Yeah, for sure.
And then sort of on that, I guess you mentioned the changes that you've seen. What and the changes kind of politically, the Brexit, the inability to bring material into the country, which that sounds like it's changing, has sort of forced you guys to really focus on the native species and cultivating your local ceramicists or pot makers. Do you see any other changes that are sort of guiding that that shift at all outside of that? I guess what role does the access to the internet, like if you don't have to go see the trees in person, you can see what someone's doing in Europe or in America or wherever. Does that influence it at all, or is it kind of just keeping yourself aware of what's happening?
I think people are, they're aspirational when they see amazing trees with lots of dead wood, and they try to recreate themselves with that, with lesser material, by carving, or doing a tanuki or whatever. I think they want to be aspirational in that regard. But what I tend to do with my group is kind of ground them and say, look, this is the material that we've got. We need to bring out the best in the material that we have. And if you're producing a deciduous hawthorn, 10 years is your average time to do it. Now, fortunately, most of my guys are under the age of 40. So, I mean, I'm 70 next time. So, and it is one of the tragedies in life that some people, when they retire, they decide that they're going to start doing bonsai. Well, I'm afraid, guys, you're 50 years too late. But it's quite interesting that when we say in England, wet behind the ears, when they're starting out, most of them are going for a naturalistic form. For example, if you have a club exhibition in the UK, they have, the visitor vote, the people's vote. And invariably, they choose a bonsai that looks like a little tree, not one that is sculptural or a little avant-garde or just, displays a lot of dead wood. And that's still the mindset of, I think, when people are coming in to do bonsai in the UK. Whereas if you are from Italy and you visit somewhere like Mauro Stenberger's Bonsai Dream, that's where you're going to aspire to. You're not going to be aspiring to, somebody producing a small, 10-year-old larch tree, in a Chinese pot. So, I say to most people when I'm talking to them, it's all about where you start from. What's the material that you're working with? And that is culturally significantly different from Southern Europe to Northern Europe. Because, certainly Denmark and Holland, Belgium, they just don't have the access to that material. They can go and get it. They can go drive south and get it, but on their doorstep, they don't have it. And we don't have it.
Yeah, I'm interested to talk a little bit about the perspective of the public in the UK. How does the public sort of think of bonsai or respond to bonsai? What's kind of the general view of it?
All right. So most people's first experience with bonsai is traditionally at a large garden show. We have the RHS, the Royal Horticultural Society. They have their shows that take place within the UK, and of course we've just had Chelsea that's taken place last weekend. And the way that the trees are exhibited at these shows, as they are as specimens on two shelves, a higher shelf and a lower shelf. They're not displayed as you would display it at Pacific Bonsai and as we would display it in a bonsai exhibition. So it's their first experience. So, and invariably what people want is they want to go away with a bonsai, and if it's a club show, they'll give them a reasonably good bonsai to take away with them. But that's their impression of what bonsai is. I give a number of lectures, and I give them to various charities and women's organizations like WI and that sort of thing. And I give a talk, and the talk is actually called "I Had a Bonsai Once, It Died." That's the name of the talk, because invariably when they meet me, and my wife said, "Oh, by the way, he does bonsai," that's the next thing they say. And it's a tragedy that most people's experience in bonsai is getting one from a garden center that's been imported from South Korea and is probably already dead. And they take it home and it dies because they don't know how to look after it and don't maintain it. If they've got anything about them, they'll join a club. Usually they buy another one and that one dies. And that's their impression of what bonsai is, And it's, it's quite interesting because we have open garden. In August, we have an open garden here. And it's really interesting. We invite all of our friends and neighbors on one day and the bonsai community the next day. And there's cake, by the way.
That's why they're coming, right?
And if you stay late enough, after 5 o'clock, there's wine and beer. Nice. But so it's quite interesting that the neighbors because if you look at the front of my property, you would not know that what is in the back. There's no impression at all from the front. So it's really interesting when our neighbors come around and go, "Oh, do you mean they're all outside?" That's the first thing. Well, yeah, they're in the garden. They usually, the questions are usually, how old is it? And the next one is, how much is it worth? So it's a different perspective, they have.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's similar to the experiences we have here, the focus on age and value, and then just sort of the basics of watering and general care. But it sounds like the way that the people of the UK encounter bonsai are at these long running traditional garden shows, and they're being presented as plant specimens as if it was a rose or a chrysanthemum or some other sort of horticultural endeavor. And so do people, I guess, then sort of that distinction where it moves into this idea of an art form, I think probably only comes when you really start to get past that stage and begin to pursue it more. I mean, I guess, do you have to be a professional to operate in bonsai as an art form to where you're going to see these individualistic characteristic styles come out? Like, because you obviously have to get to a point. And so I don't think these sort of broader ideas of a culture having a bonsai style like Pinjing or bonsai in Japan, you have to kind of almost get to someone who's been practicing it and studying it for a few decades to have that sense of style emerge. And so yeah, I guess is there's just fewer examples of that. is kind of where I'm trying to get, because someone seen it at that garden show isn't going to have a sense of cultural identity represented in bonsai, right?
No.
So yeah, that's interesting.
I did have an answer for you, but it's just gone out of my head. So bear with me for a moment. I mean, I'm giving a talk next week to a brand new club that's starting in a city north of where I live. I'm doing it for free. Of course, I'm doing it for free because I want to encourage more people to understand what bonsai really is, and also to help that club to get some new members, etc. And I've had to be very careful about the presentation that I give, that I don't scare people off. Mm-hmm. So what I am doing is the talk is going to be on hawthorns. I do a digital presentation. I'm going to take a tree that I've been working for nearly 40 years. I'm going to be taking a tree that I planted as a 1-year-old 4 years ago. And I'm going to say there's as much enjoyment in this one as there is in the big one. But don't think you can get the big one instantly, because you can't, So I've got to be very careful that I don't scare people off in, showing this, magnificent, 600-700-year-old yew tree that I've got in my garden, So I've got to be very careful in that regard. But I think, I had people come to me, because I do like a gift voucher at Christmas for people to give to their husbands or whatever. And it's amazing how I discover that they've already been doing what they call bonsai. They've had an acorn that they planted 20 years ago, and they think it's a bonsai, whereas in actual fact, it's just a tree that they've managed to keep alive in a pot. Mm-hmm. So then I sort of say to them, well, you need to be able to do this. You should be able to style this, but it's certainly, I have to treat people very carefully in the early days of sort of developing them and developing their skill.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm going to change subjects just a little bit and topics, but how do you approach display? Because we're talking about kind of this display in garden shows, and then we're comparing it or contrasting it to the trophy and the Ginkgo Awards at one point, and Soliu and all these other sort of European shows. I mean, I think for me, that's when bonsai enters into the realm of art, is when you're taking it from the bench and putting it on display. How do you approach that transition personally?
Okay, I'm gonna. I sound like I'm doing sound bites here, but for me, bonsai in your garden is horticulture. It's elevated to art when it's put in an exhibition and displayed beautifully, properly, with the right environment, having a good backdrop that is, you can clearly see the work that's been done. The pot is good. If it's on a table, it's good. If it has a scroll, it's relevant. If it has an accent plant, it's relevant to the seasons or to the scale of the tree. That's when it's elevated to art. And, it's very interesting, because when I walk around a show and I'm walking with my gang, my students and stuff, we ask 3 questions. It's very simple. We ask these questions because you never know, is the owner standing behind you? Mm. So the 3 questions are this, and it's a very simple one. Do you like it? Yeah, we like it. Okay. If it was yours, is there anything you would change in it? And normally people say, yeah, you know what? I'm not so sure about that brand show. And the last question is, would I have it in my garden? Would you have it in your garden? Okay. Now, it's not necessarily the same as, yeah, I like it. Well, no, I wouldn't have it in my garden, because there's a reason you wouldn't have it in your garden. A, you don't have the right, weather. It might be from the south of Italy. It's not going to grow in Manchester, so I wouldn't have it in my garden. I'd like to have it in my garden, but I won't have it in my garden. Or, in all of the thousands of trees that I've seen, there's only one tree where everybody in the group said, yeah, we like it. No, we wouldn't change anything. And yeah, we definitely have it in our garden.
What tree was that?
I knew you'd ask that question.
Of course.
And you know what? The guy knows. It's David Benavente's Cascade Pine. And it is quite exquisite. It is quite perfect. And you know what? It didn't win the trophy when it was in the trophy. Another tree won. Yet for us, it was an absolute standout tree.
Yeah.
But you know, let me finish.
Yeah, go for it.
This whole idea of would I change anything, I think is a healthy thing, because it says, you know, a lot of bonsai is subjective. You know, and if you look at some of my trees, I'd like to have definite foliage, branches and clouds. And if you look at, for example, Melrose trees, he creates more of a canopy, you know. So if you put one of my trees alongside one of Melrose trees, they'd say, yeah, that's Melrose, yeah, that's Tony's. Because that's the way, you know. And it's, as you said earlier, I could walk around a show and I say, yeah, I know whose that is. Yeah, I know whose that is. Simply by the way they're styled.
So you think that distinction is much more on the individual level rather than the cultural, broad cultural level?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You know, if you had I could tell you immediately in a show which one is Peter Warren's. But his attention to detail and the way that he presents, you know?
Yeah, and that's interesting because as individuals, we're so, you know, that's the expression of those, that of our culture of origin, right? Of our experiences growing up, the environment we've grown up in, and then mixed through that kind of lens of ourself is that really, you know, combination of factors that I think you ultimately see in bonsai, where you can see, you know, one of Ryan's trees is very distinct versus something that you know, Michael Hagedorn would do. Yeah, I was going to ask, you know, maybe add another question to your 3 questions, or try it out next year. You know, can your students identify the country of origin of that tree? Is there anything that you guys are, as you go through, noticing where do you think this tree came from, right? And I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if it's possible to do that without referencing the species, because that's, like you said, kind of the biggest outlier. That's the tell, is you can tell where a tree is from by its species and all of these environmental cues. And it's really interesting to see if we can start to identify some visual styling characteristics that might embody, you know, just like painting, schools of painting, you know, there's certain, like the Impressionists, or, you know, the Southern school in China or whatever, right? There are these sort of
the cultural differences.
Yeah, exactly. And even, you know, maybe even regional differences. But yeah, I'm not sure if it's possible to separate the environment from the style. It's so ingrained, but I'm curious to know, yeah, what your thoughts are on that.
Well, it's interesting because last year I exhibited a Cascade pine tree in absolutely traditional Japanese style on a beautiful Japanese table, you know, and the amount of people that didn't realize it was my tree, because I'd gone completely the opposite way. And when it was being photographed by Willy van der Poel, the amazing photographer in Belgium, I put it on, and Willie turned around to me and said, "Whose tree is this?" I said, "It's mine." He was like, I won't swear, but he was like, "Really?" He said, "It looks very Japanese." I went, "Yeah, I know." And I quite like that curveball, you know, throw it in there. And it's, yeah, if you've managed to get hold of the book from last year, the pine, oh, do I have it here? Hey, here we go.
Nice, right there.
I got it. How about that? How about that? Here we go. This. There you go. Let me see if you can you see that?
I can. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, you're right. It reads as much more of a traditional form. There's no barbed wire at all on that one.
No, nothing. But you know what? It's yeah. It's there are some, you know, traditional Japanese in here, but also some unusual stuff, you know. Yeah, get hold of that if you can.
Yeah, definitely.
It's the latest one.
So yeah, kind of as we get close to closing out here, I'm curious about the UK in terms of, you mentioned Peter Warren. That's someone I'm hoping to chat with about. Who are some other individuals that you think might be able to articulate on this topic about kind of culture representation in bonsai from a British perspective?
Speak to. I'll send you a list.
Okay, perfect.
That's the easiest thing. I'll send you a list.
Yeah, I appreciate any sort of leads would be helpful.
Yeah, sure.
Pursue that, because I think any good researcher is not just going to talk to one person. I'm not going to be able to interview 100 people, because there's probably not that many, but I think at least 3 individuals to provide some sort of cross section about it would be really, really interesting.
Well, yeah, I mean, hit up Peter for sure.
Mm-hmm. I know he's really busy.
He's very knowledgeable. But again, he's coming originally from a Japanese aesthetic, but really putting his own twist on it, which is really nice,
Well, I think that's one of the interesting things that you see a lot of Western trained, at least maybe here more in the US, but Peter would be included as well, where you have professionally trained Japanese apprentices, and then they come back and start to either quickly or at some point start to establish their own unique style that does sort of diverge or move away from the traditional Japanese form quite a lot. And again, I see that more in the US. I don't know if that's just more of a reference to American culture and kind of individualistic kind of freedom, and we're going to do what we want to do. But at the same time, it's just fascinating to see those people who've spent so much time in Japan. But then I think there's also people too that probably have done apprentices and still maintain that very highly refined or aligned Japanese approach too. So,
well, here's the big thing: I've never been to Japan.
Oh,
but I've been to, I know, a surprise. But I've been to China 3 times, and I'm going again in October.
Do you find what is your experience of Penjing in China? I'm really
I love it. Oh my God. I was there this year, and the theme, of course, was rock plantings and stuff. And it was really interesting because all of my students are going like, "You've gone crazy on rock plantings. What the hell's going on here?" I said, you're not going to believe this. I get this. And I showed them some of the stuff. So, I've created 3 rock plantings since I've come back, which is interesting, because I have access to some good rocks, which is cool.
Yeah, that always makes it easier. I think that's probably the most important thing in any good rock planting is the rock. You can have a really nice tree, and the rock is really, really uninteresting. But I'm interested to maybe as we close out, how would you describe Japanese bonsai and Chinese Penjing and how they differ?
All right, so I would say Japanese bonsai for sure is controlled, very much refined and controlled in the way it's expressed. I wouldn't say it's inventive at all. I think they stick to quite a rigid approach to their trees. Whereas I think that certainly in Penjing, it's more elemental. It's more naturalistic. And I just find it's quite interesting because I know there's a lot of Chinese artists that are sort of copying a lot of the way that the Japanese are doing their presentations. But, it's going to be interesting over the next, 10, 20 years with China. I think it's really rocking and rolling. But the other interesting thing about China is the trees are all enormous. I mean, just huge, I think there's only one show that I've been to where there's been a tree under a meter.
Yeah, I mean, why do you think that is? What is it about the distinction between Japan and China that would lead to such larger trees in China?
I think they've just got access to that kind of material. I mean, there's one thing we haven't talked about is shohin. Now, the interesting thing about shohin in Europe is it absolutely follows the Japanese way of presentation. And invariably the trees that win the shohin class, all the trees are from Japan.
Yeah, that's interesting. You're right. You don't see a lot of avant-garde Shohin compositions that, they're all within the box stand, and they all have the highly decorated pots. And yeah,
Yeah.
it's interesting. I think because Shohin kind of is almost like a subset of bonsai. You kind of, there's bonsai, and then to do Shohin, it's like the same thing for people who like Satsuki azaleas. You have to almost like
Yes.
become obsessed with that one thing to do it so much. So it almost has
Yeah.
like its own subculture in a way.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I mean, there's not much to say about that because that's it. It is. That's
Yeah.
the way it is.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting because we have a couple here in the UK who, go to Japan regularly, buy Japanese trees, exhibits them beautifully, perfectly. Mark and Rita Cooper. I think those are some. I'll give you their information to talk to because that's quite interesting
Mm.
because they've got a view on what's happening here in the UK.
Interesting. Okay.
I
Yeah.
think there's one thing I can say: we're all very excited in the
Mm.
UK
Mm.
that it is very, very healthy, which I'm so pleased because I didn't think it was going to be. I thought we were just going to go into a steady decline because we haven't got access to Europe, but that thankfully has changed in the last couple of weeks.
Well, that's wonderful. Yeah, I think the US also was in a very similar situation when we are limited to import material. And so it's forced us to turn to look at our native plants more so. And yeah, it's kind of been the same thing over the last 15-ish years or so, 20 years, where native
Yeah.
material has really become the predominant material sought after, and reflecting the environments of the US rather than
Yeah.
duplicating kind of the pine tree form for some trees that really just don't grow that way here at all. So I think, yeah, I agree. It's an extremely exciting time for bonsai, and trying to, the goal of this exhibition is really to kind of capture the unique qualities of bonsai and how each country kind of is doing its own thing, or sort of, or that's emerging. And it sounds like the UK is right there along with us and trying to find their own way of doing it.
Mm. Well, I think you got some good guys out collecting. The Backcountry Boys there are doing some nice work. Randy Knight, of course, doing some amazing stuff, and Ryan working that beautiful material. And I think you've got some great artists there in America. I mean, Boone is a superb artist.
Mm-hmm.
It really
Absolutely.
is.
Yeah.
You know, and I think and Sutin.
Mm-hmm.
Sutin is one of your guys who's doing some amazing showing. So,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
I just want to end on one thing. I thought the exhibition you did with the skateboards was mind blowing.
Thank you.
Oh my god! I referenced it in a blog post
Yeah.
I put together.
Yeah, I well that I you referenced that, and then also I think Ryan, and you called us Mavericks, and so I've sort of
Ah, yes,
have embraced that. Being a bonsai maverick is kind of a fun term that I like. So yeah, I continue to try to find new ways to, again, bring people from the outside in, not just presenting
sure.
bonsai as this horticultural curiosity. And so I think with the World Cup and this focus on sport and kind of bringing people together through that, we have that in the bonsai. But is there a way that we can kind of also celebrate cultural differences within that same kind of art form as sort of soccer does? This is really interesting. So I think, but hopefully people who are traveling to the US or engaged in sort of that love of soccer will find a new appreciation for bonsai, because who would ever have thought there's anything related between
Sure.
soccer and bonsai, right? But hopefully we can find
Absolutely.
something that would get people to pay attention to that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And when you get it up and running, let me know. I'll broadcast it through my channels.
Yeah, I'd love to. And then on the last thing is, if you have, I'm trying to collect some photos of what you think. If you send me one or two photographs of trees, of a tree that embodies what you think British bonsai is for you, I want to sort of get some references so I can present these to the audience and say, here are some examples of what you think, or British practitioners would identify as British bonsai.
Okay. Then they will definitely be deciduous.
Yes, I would imagine so, with some hollow trunks in there and some gorgeous containers.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Well, it's been really cool talking to you. Thank you very much.
Yes, Tony, thank you so much for taking the time, and hopefully we'll see you at some show in 2026 somewhere.
Yeah, I've been. Yeah, well, I'm hoping to get over to the States at some point. I'm not so sure about your situation at the moment over there.
Yeah, for sure.
We don't need to dwell on that.
Yeah.
But I was supposed to be with Nature's Way Bonsai this year, but had to pull out for family reasons.
Okay.
But yeah, but you're doing some cool stuff at Pacific. I love that. I love the way that you're presenting the stuff.
Thank you so much, Tony. Yeah, well, if you're ever in this neck of the woods, please come by. And
absolutely.
All right.
All right. Good to talk to you.
Talk to you later.
Anytime. Bye.
Bye-bye.